When crack cocaine began consuming the streets of Washington, D.C., those profiting from it were prepared to defend their territory at any cost. Gang members deployed every tactic available to stay out of the hands of law enforcement, and as their desperation grew, so did the body count. In the early 1990s, no city in America was more defined by bloodshed than the nation's capital. The drug trade had turned entire neighborhoods into war zones, and virtually no one living in those communities was left unaffected. By 1994, that wave of violence would reach a target no one could have anticipated the people sworn to stop it. Jim Kallstrom, former head, FBI New York office. When officers of the law became the targets, the FBI took on the responsibility of hunting down the man at the center of it all, the head of the most dangerous gang Washington, D.C. had ever seen. October 26, 1994. Long after the sun had gone down over the nation's capital, 3 men wearing masks forced their way into a private residence in the northwest part of the city. Their target was Gerald Gaither, a local drug dealer they believed was holding cash. They demanded he hand over whatever he had. The homeowner, William Ragland, was confronted separately while he worked alone in his basement. On the upper floor, another intruder came across 2 women, Nancy Hatchett and her granddaughter Darlene. All of the residents were subjected to a terrifying ordeal. The women were forced to the floor at gunpoint. Gaither insisted he had nothing more to give. One of the armed men responded by firing at an 89-year-old retired government employee who was present. He died where he stood. A second resident, Andre Madison, was shoved into the living area. One of the intruders spotted the gold chain around his neck and tore it away. With one person already dead and Gaither still refusing to cooperate, the situation deteriorated rapidly. More shots were fired. The plan had fallen apart entirely. All 3 men bolted from the house. One of them was sick near the rear exit before disappearing into the night. Nancy Hatchett reached for the phone and called for help. Officers from D.C.'s Metropolitan Police Department arrived quickly at the address, which sat within a neighborhood well known to law enforcement for drug activity. When they entered, they found 3 people dead: William Ragland, Darlene Hatchett, and Gerald Gaither. The scene was photographed and shell casings were gathered as evidence. Outside, near the back of the house, officers noted traces of vomit on the ground. Nancy Hatchett and Andre Madison had survived. Both attempted to assist detectives in identifying the attackers, but the masks the men had worn made it nearly impossible. Metropolitan Homicide Detective Anthony Brigantine II. The primary target of the triple murder was someone known around 1st and Kennedy Street as a drug dealer. He was the type who drove expensive cars, wore the latest clothes, and flashed serious money. When he couldn't produce what the intruders wanted, the situation turned violent. People in the surrounding area told officers that following the sound of gunfire, they observed a dark sedan with a noticeably loud exhaust pulling away from the scene. A bulletin went out immediately describing the vehicle and the 3 occupants believed to be inside it. Less than an hour later, patrol officers encountered a car matching the description. The men inside were asked to provide identification. The driver gave his name as Benny Lee Lawson. The 2 passengers were identified as Kobe Mowat and Jermaine Graves. During a check of the men's clothing, a broken gold chain was discovered on one of them. The full significance of this wouldn't become clear until later, as crime scene details were still being compiled. All 3 men had their names and addresses recorded before being allowed to leave. Nothing found in the vehicle was enough to formally connect them to the killings. Even without a clear suspect, homicide detectives working the case had formed a strong working theory. Gaither had been killed because of a conflict with a competing drug operation. Crack cocaine had begun reshaping Washington, D.C. as early as 1990. Street-level gangs multiplied rapidly as the financial rewards of drug distribution became undeniable. As the money grew, so did the violence, each crew willing to spill blood to hold on to its corner. By 1994, the city was recording close to 400 killings annually. Law enforcement at the local and federal level had formed joint operations to address the epidemic, yet the vast majority of those murders remained without resolution. Detectives went back into the neighborhood surrounding the crime scene, knocking on doors and asking questions. Most residents refused to engage. Fear had made cooperation a luxury few could afford. A small number were willing to pass along tips by phone, anonymously. One of those calls pointed back to Benny Lawson, the same man stopped near the scene on the night of the murders. Further investigation revealed that the gold necklace recovered from one of the men in Lawson's car was a match for the one ripped from Andre Madison during the attack. Detective Brigantine 2. The interview with Lawson stretched across several hours. Multiple detectives rotated in and out, each trying a different approach to get him to acknowledge some level of involvement in the triple murder. He denied everything from start to finish and flatly refused to submit to a polygraph. In a bid to unsettle him, investigators told Lawson falsely that forensic analysis of the vomit found at the scene could place him there through DNA testing. He didn't flinch. After 4 hours of questioning with no progress, there was no legal basis to hold him, and he walked out. A search of law enforcement databases on Lawson's name returned a significant result. Intelligence units had already flagged him as an active member of one of the most feared criminal organizations in the city, the 1st and Kennedy Street Crew, a gang named after the intersection that served as its home base. Founded in 1988, the crew had built a record of drug distribution, theft, abduction, targeted shootings, and homicide. Kobe Mowat and Jermaine Graves, the two men riding with Lawson that night, wasted no time confronting him after his extended session with detectives. In their world, spending that much time with police could mean only one thing. They were convinced he had given the crew up. Lawson was furious. He despised law enforcement and made clear he had said absolutely nothing. Since no one had been charged, Graves was partially reassured, though he made a point of saying he would flee the country before allowing himself to be indicted for murder. Lawson, for his part, swore he would never again set foot inside a prison where he had been assaulted during a previous sentence. He went home that night carrying the weight of an accusation that, in the world he operated in, could get a man killed. Being called an informant wasn't just an insult on these streets. It was effectively a death warrant. November 22nd, 1994. With Thanksgiving just days away, Benny Lawson made his way back to the Metropolitan Police Building. It was mid-afternoon, just after 3 o'clock. He was looking for the homicide unit that had interrogated him, but got turned around along the way. He stopped 2 teenagers and asked for directions. They pointed him in the wrong direction, straight toward the cold case homicide squad. That unit was a collaborative effort between the MPD and the FBI, assembled specifically to reopen and reinvestigate the city's growing backlog of unsolved murders. On duty that afternoon were FBI agents Martha Dixon Martinez, John Kufta, and Mike Miller, along with Metropolitan Police Sergeant Hank Daly. Without any warning, Lawson produced an M11 assault weapon and began firing. In an instant, the headquarters of one of America's most prominent law enforcement agencies had become a crime scene. Gunfire rang through the corridors. Detectives from elsewhere in the building scrambled toward the 3rd floor where the attack was unfolding. Supervisory Special Agent Mark Giuliano. We were at the FBI's Washington field office, monitoring a police radio channel, when a call came through reporting shots fired at MPD headquarters. We confirmed the shooting was happening inside that building and immediately began trying to reach the agents we had assigned to the cold case squad. As the minutes passed, some of them weren't responding. We started to understand that our people might be in that room. The radio traffic kept getting worse. They were calling for emergency assistance for a critically wounded agent, Special Agent John Kufta. When the gunfire started, I could hear officers in the hallway just outside trying to force their way through the door. They were only feet away. Someone called out that they couldn't get in. I made a decision in that moment. I was not going to die in that room. I thought about my wife. I thought about my daughter, who was barely a month old. I told myself that if I stayed conscious, kept breathing, kept praying, and they could get me to a hospital, I would survive. Kufta had taken bullets in the thigh, arm, abdomen, neck, and chest. Despite his wounds, he reached the door and got it open. Officers on the other side pulled him to safety. Sergeant Hank Daly was the only other survivor visible in the room in critical condition. He was dragged to the hallway and rushed to a waiting helicopter that transported him for emergency care. Officers held their positions around the building, unwilling to move in without knowing whether the shooter had accomplices or planned a second assault. SWAT teams from across the Washington area converged on the scene. As they prepared to breach, voices could still be heard from within the room. When the door finally gave way, the team found FBI agent Mike Miller's body. His sidearm had never left its holster. In an adjoining space, they came across an unidentified black male who had sustained a wound to the hip and a fatal shot to the head. Agent Martha Dixon Martinez was discovered last. She had been shot in the back. Nearby lay the weapon believed to have been used in the killings, the M11 assault weapon. A voice calling out from inside a closet led the team to one of the two teenagers who had been present when the shooting began. They had been caught in the middle of it. The other teenager had been shot in the leg, but managed to escape the office before the door was sealed. Special Agent Giuliano. Walking through that hallway, seeing the blood, taking in the scope of what had happened, it was unlike anything I had ever experienced. You could see it in everyone's face. People were pushing through the emotion, trying to stay focused on finding out what had happened and whether the threat was still active. Evidence at the scene allowed investigators to piece together the sequence of events. After Miller, Kufta, and Daly were hit in the initial burst of gunfire, Agent Dixon Martinez entered the exchange. She succeeded in wounding the shooter in the hip before she herself was struck in the arm. She dropped her weapon. The shooter picked it up, a 9mm service pistol, and shot her in the back as she attempted to reach cover. He then used the same weapon on himself. Officers collected the shooter's fingerprints. Whatever those prints revealed would need to explain the incomprehensible. 2 FBI agents were gone. Sergeant Hank Daly would succumb to his injuries before long. It marked the first occasion in nearly a decade that more than one agent had been killed in a single incident, and one of the gravest single attacks on Washington's police force in memory. Agent Kufta would face 7 surgeries on his road to recovery. The losses were felt throughout law enforcement. Special Agent Giuliano. Martha, Mike, and Hank were everything a law enforcement officer should be. They didn't simply lose their lives. They gave them in service of something they believed in completely. The investigation moved quickly. When the fingerprint results came back, a detective walked into a room full of homicide officials and investigators and made the announcement. The shooter was Benny Lee Lawson, Jr. For Detective Brigantine, the news landed like a punch. His squad had been the intended target all along. The 1st and Kennedy Street crew was now the prime suspect in the murders of William Ragland, Darlene Hatchett, and Gerald Gaither, and the attack at headquarters had removed any doubt about how far they were willing to go. Detective Brigantine 2. What law enforcement has had to accept is that these crews and gangs are absolutely committed to their objectives. They will not hesitate, and they will not hold back. There is no line they won't cross. With federal officers among the dead, the FBI formally assumed jurisdiction over the investigation of the crew. Detective Brigantine 2. I was assigned to work alongside the FBI in investigating the 1st and Kennedy Street crew. The organization we believed was directly responsible for what happened inside that police building. Detective Brigantine shared his accumulated knowledge of Lawson and the crew with the task force. Agent John Kerr was among those assigned to the investigation. Special Agent John Kerr. Lawson's ties to the 1st and Kennedy Street crew forced us to ask hard questions. Was this a lone act of rage or was it planned? Did he have support? Was there any chance of further attacks on law enforcement? Those were the questions that drove us to open a full investigation. We needed to know whether this was part of something larger. A search warrant was executed that same evening for the residence where Lawson had been living. Inside his room, investigators found a handwritten note directed at the homicide detectives who had questioned him, explicitly threatening their lives. Drawings of violent scenes, gang-affiliated writings, and aggressive rap lyrics covered nearly every surface. Special Agent Giuliano. What we found in that room made one thing undeniable. These individuals didn't just participate in violence. They celebrated it, glorified it, and aspired to it. The lyrics, the drawings, the videos, it was all an expression of who they chose to be. While the fallen officers and agents were being laid to rest, the task force was mapping out how to ensure no other family would face the same loss. 6 homicides were now attributed to the crew, including 2 federal agents and a D.C. police sergeant. A combined FBI and MPD task force took formal shape and began accumulating intelligence on the 1st and Kennedy Street crew from the ground up. Special Agent Giuliano. The objectives were clear. Build a full picture of the crew's criminal operations, understand what drove Lawson to that police building, and determine whether anyone helped him carry out the attack or helped the gang cover their tracks afterward. The scrutiny that followed the MPD headquarters attack drove the crew underground. Members reduced their time in public spaces and became even more suspicious of unfamiliar faces. The idea of placing an undercover operative within the group was evaluated and dismissed as far too dangerous. Special Agent Giuliano. This was a tight, disciplined group. They looked out for one another and were deeply skeptical of anyone they didn't already know. That was true before the attack. Afterward, it was even more pronounced. Putting someone on the inside simply wasn't a realistic option. The alternative was patient, methodical, covert surveillance. Over time, the gang settled back into its routine and agents were watching every move. Special Agent Giuliano. We had eyes on the area continuously day and night. We tracked everyone who came through, noted the buyers, logged what time they appeared, where they went afterward, how the transactions were made. Every detail was documented. The surveillance confirmed what investigators already suspected. At the top of the organization were Kobe Mowat and his trusted second-in-command, Jermaine Graves, the same 2 men who had been in Lawson's car on the night of the triple murder. Special Agent Kerr. Kobe Mowat's reputation within that community was rooted entirely in fear. He was volatile, unpredictable, and always armed. When his temper ignited, violence usually followed. Digging into Mowat's background, investigators found that his relationship with Graves and Lawson stretched back years. All 3 had crossed paths at D.C.'s Lorton Correctional Complex in Virginia in 1990, where they were serving sentences related to weapons charges connected to a planned gang shooting. Their bond had formed behind those walls. The task force had strong reason to believe Mowat and Graves were involved in all 6 murders under investigation, but both men were staying carefully out of sight. Agents recognized that they needed a strategy built for the long game, one that would eventually sweep up not just the 2 leaders, but every member of the operation. The approach they settled on was a comprehensive conspiracy case covering the crew's full criminal footprint, from drug trafficking to homicide. Agents established positions near 1st and Kennedy Street and began targeting the crew's regular customers. Arresting buyers would serve 2 purposes. It would capture criminal activity on record, and it would create leverage to develop informants from within the network. Special Agent Giuliano. We'd move in during peak selling hours, hoping to catch someone in possession and potentially get them to work with us going forward. Resistance was common at first. The reputations of Mowat and Graves made cooperation feel more dangerous than prison. But lengthy sentences have a way of changing calculations. The approach eventually produced a significant result. One of the crew's primary suppliers, facing a substantial prison term, chose to work with the FBI. Directed by agents, he began steering conversations with crew members toward their criminal history. Special Agent Giuliano. He would casually bring up an old shooting, a past murder, something about the drug business, and they would open up. They'd talk about who was involved, what went down. All of it recorded. Through those recordings, agents uncovered another murder one that had occurred less than 3 weeks before, the break-in at William Ragland's home. Mowat, Graves, and Lawson had abducted and killed a rival drug dealer named William "Billy" Woods. Woods was affiliated with a competing gang. Graves engineered a trap luring Woods to his mother's house under false pretenses. Once there, the three robbed and brutally beat him. Concerned about retaliation from Woods' associates, they shot him 3 times and left his body in the street. A second informant provided additional testimony that pointed directly at Mowat, Graves, and Lawson in connection with the triple murder at the Ragland house. Special Agent Kerr. He had been present when Benny, Kobe, and Jermaine were discussing the triple homicide. What stood out was that they were giving Benny a hard time specifically because he had gotten sick at the scene. That particular detail had never been made public. Only the detectives and we knew about it. The evidence was still largely indirect, but the combination of months of surveillance footage and recorded informant testimony was finally enough to support search warrant applications for the homes of both Kobe Mowat and Jermaine Graves. The team moved on Graves first, sending in a heavily armed unit. Special Agent Giuliano. Inside the residence, we recovered a 9mm semi-automatic handgun and what appeared to be crack cocaine. Using the firearm as the basis, one of our people drafted an affidavit for an arrest warrant. Graves was a convicted felon, and possessing a firearm made him immediately chargeable. Graves managed to stay hidden for several weeks. Surveillance continued, and agents waited. Then, during what appeared to be a routine observation, Agent Giuliano noticed someone whose stride looked unmistakable. Special Agent Giuliano. I caught a glimpse of someone from behind. The way he moved looked exactly like Jermaine Graves. I couldn't confirm his face from my position, so I radioed one of the other units and asked them to circle the block for a closer look. Within moments, they had jumped out and taken him into custody. Right there on the corner of First and Kennedy, they recognized him the second they pulled up. Graves was off the streets. The next target was Mowat himself. The SWAT team hit the house he shared with his twin brother simultaneously, catching both men completely off guard. Inside, agents found gang documents, drawings, written materials, and a small quantity of marijuana. No weapons and nothing directly tied to the murders, but those weren't the primary focus at this stage. Special Agent Giuliano. What we were really after was organizational evidence, crew member lists, branded clothing, photographs, contact information. Anything that established this group as a unified criminal enterprise. Both twins were booked on drug charges. Kobe's time behind bars turned out to be short-lived when the evidence was examined more carefully. Only his brother Kareem's fingerprints were found on the marijuana. The charge against Kobe was dropped, and he was released. Investigators were not finished with him. The pressure on the gang continued to mount. Development of informants inside the crew was ongoing, and eventually produced the breakthrough the task force had been working toward. A crew member facing drug charges agreed to cooperate, and for the first time, the full picture of why Benny Lawson had walked into police headquarters became clear. It had all started the night Mowat, Graves, and Lawson entered William Ragland's home. The plan had been straightforward: rob Gerald Gaither. When Gaither refused to give them what they came for, Graves lost control and killed 3 people. Outside the house, Lawson was overcome and vomited. In Mowat's eyes, it was a display of weakness he could not respect. That contempt deepened when Lawson was later brought in for extended questioning. Mowat concluded that no innocent man would sit with detectives for 4 hours. He began telling others in the crew that Lawson was informing. Special Agent Kerr. Lawson's hatred of informants was extreme even by the standards of that world. He had physically assaulted someone he believed was cooperating with police. To have Kobe Mowat publicly brand him as a snitch in front of everyone he ran with was something he simply could not absorb. The picture was now complete. Mowat, Graves, and Lawson had carried out the triple homicide, and Mowat's accusation had been the spark that sent Lawson through the doors of the Metropolitan Police Department. Prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office reviewed the evidence. Special Agent Giuliano. Between the cooperating witnesses, the recorded conversations, and the information from the car stop on the night of the triple murder, we had no doubt. We had more than enough to support murder warrants. The case against Mowat also reflected his role in driving Lawson to commit the police headquarters attack. The task force went before a grand jury with a full conspiracy presentation targeting Mowat and every member of the crew. The resulting indictment contained 57 charges covering nearly a dozen homicides, drug trafficking, armed robbery, abduction, and racketeering. Graves, already detained, was charged with 3 counts of felony murder. A warrant was issued for Mowat's arrest. When investigators arrived at his address, they found an empty house. Closets had been cleared out. The space looked as though it had been vacated deliberately. Sifting through discarded items, agents found a receipt for an airline ticket. Special Agent Giuliano. The ticket had been purchased just days before we arrived. It was a flight from New York to Moscow. That told us Kobe hadn't just left the city, he had left the country. Agents attempted to trace him through Russia but found nothing. Records suggested a connection to a flight bound for Africa shortly after his Moscow arrival. A review of that flight's passenger manifest turned up no useful leads. For half a year, investigators across Washington, D.C. worked to locate a man who could be anywhere on Earth. The search had gone international. Special Agent Giuliano. We went months without a single lead. Hundreds of documents from prior search warrants were reviewed again, searching for foreign phone numbers, relatives living abroad. Every time, nothing. The stalemate finally broke when Agent Kerr, working a separate informant, surfaced the name of a former girlfriend of Mowat's. Special Agent Kerr. We located an address for her and pulled her phone records. Among them was a collect call placed from Kenya, timed to coincide roughly with when Kobe would have landed in Africa. The woman was brought in for questioning and initially denied all knowledge of Mowat's location. When agents produced the phone records and made clear that continued silence would result in a grand jury summons, she relented. She confirmed that Kobe had called her multiple times from Nairobi, though not recently. Her best guess was that he had since relocated to Tanzania. The lead was forwarded immediately. The call had originated from a specific hotel in Nairobi, which a U.S. State Department regional security officer in Kenya went to investigate. The hotel owner claimed no memory of anyone matching Mowat's description. Special Agent Giuliano. We were running out of threads. The only one still intact was that hotel. So we asked the regional security officer to go back and push harder. The owner maintained his denial on the return visit until photographs were placed in front of him. Something shifted in his expression. The security officer pressed on. Eventually, the owner asked for assurance that cooperating would never be traced back to him. That assurance was given. He then confirmed that Mowat had stayed at his property but had departed months earlier. He offered a phone number that Mowat had dialed from the hotel. T connected to Tanzania. It took investigators a few days to piece together how this hotel owner had come to protect a wanted American gang leader. Mowat's mother had studied in Jamaica, and for the years had cultivated connections with people who had scattered to various parts of the world. The hotel owner was one of them. She had personally reached out and asked him to shield her son. The number traced in Tanzania led to a university professor, a contact of Mowat's mother. The FBI requested that Tanzanian National Police follow up. The professor refused to engage. The National Police launched their own inquiry into Mowat's movements within the country. While that search intensified abroad, the Washington, D.C. operation continued building out the case against the remaining crew membership, drawing on an extensive body of surveillance records and informant accounts. Special Agent Giuliano. At its peak, this investigation had between 20 and 25 MPD officers and FBI agents working around the clock, chasing phone records, reconstructing old murders, tracking every lead we could find. On September 14, 1995, more than a dozen arrest warrants were executed simultaneously. A search for any evidence of Mowat's precise location in Africa came up empty, but additional evidence of the crew's criminal enterprise was seized, including financial documents, weapons, drugs, and organizational materials. Several of those taken into custody chose to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentencing. One by one, the crew's members were being removed from the streets. In Tanzania, the investigation was closing in. National police had cultivated their own sources and confirmed that Mowat had in fact had contact with the university professor. They returned to him with a new posture, and with the threat of deportation hanging over the Jamaican-born academic, his resistance crumbled. He acknowledged helping Mowat find somewhere to hide and agreed to take authorities directly to the location. Special Agent Giuliano. Where they ended up was in the most remote setting imaginable, deep in rural Tanzania, among communities living in traditional structures, surrounded by open land and wildlife. No one searching for a fugitive from Washington, D.C. would have ever thought to look there. Mowat had no idea he had been given up. When police approached his location, he immediately began burning items that might identify him. Officers moved quickly, extinguishing the fire before significant damage was done. While searching for a legal basis to detain him without revealing the real reason for their presence, they noticed a small marijuana crop behind the structure where he had been staying. Under Tanzanian law, possession carried a sentence of 10 years or a fine of $100. Special Agent Giuliano. They brought him in on that charge, never telling him the real reason they were there. He thought he was being held for the marijuana. News reached Washington that Mowat was in custody, but the window was narrow. The drug possession charge could only hold him for so long, and as someone deeply embedded in the narcotics trade, a $100 fine was nothing. Days of careful diplomatic work followed before extradition arrangements were completed and made legally binding. Agent Giuliano and Detective Brigantine flew to Tanzania to personally escort Mowat back. After more than a year, they were finally standing in the same room as the man they had been chasing across 2 continents. Special Agent Giuliano. He looked exhausted. He looked like someone who already knew it was over. We laid out the charges that he was being returned to the United States, that he had been indicted on multiple counts, including first-degree murder and racketeering. There was nothing left for him to say. Kobe Mowat was on a plane back to America. Together, he and the remaining members of the 1st and Kennedy Street crew faced 57 counts. Both Mowat and Graves were ultimately convicted on every charge brought against them. Each received a 35-year federal prison sentence. Mowat's return triggered a collapse in what remained of the crew. Special Agent Giuliano. Bringing Kobe back set off a chain reaction. One by one, every remaining crew member entered a guilty plea. They told us directly once they saw that we had tracked him all the way to East Africa and brought him home, they believed there was nothing they could do. No place was far enough. For the agents and officers who had devoted years to this investigation, the final conviction was about more than closing a case. It was about something far more personal. Justice had been delivered not only for the community that had lived under the crew's shadow, but for the colleagues they had lost along the way. Sergeant Hank Daly, Agent Mike Miller, Agent Martha Dixon Martinez, Special Agent John Kufta. Putting this entire group behind bars sent a message that couldn't be ignored by any criminal organization operating in Washington, D.C. or anywhere nearby. The FBI and the D.C. police will do whatever it takes. Cross the ocean if they have to. They will find you, and they will bring you back.